Hey, my name's Brent. Welcome back to 49cc Scoot and part 2 of the TMAX 500 service series. In part 1, I began a major service by removing a bunch of body panels and replacing a faulty fuel pump assembly. So if you missed it, be sure to go back and check that out. The next thing that I want to work toward doing is being able to adjust the valves, or to check the valves anyway. And the valve cover is right about here, so you can imagine that's going to be a lot of fun to get to. The radiator's got to come off, and a whole bunch of stuff up here, the airbox, throttle bodies, I think, a lot of stuff. But I also want to check the steering head bearing. I have a feeling there's no need. I know at the 12,000 mile service the thing looked brand new and I repacked it anyway, so it's probably going to be the same deal now. But while it's this far apart, I might as well. So that means the handlebars and basically the front end has to come off of it as well. So I'm going to start working on all of that stuff. I didn't actually take the steering all the way apart because I'll probably save that for later. I'm kind of doing the worst first at this moment, kind of get it over with sort of idea. And I want to get to those valves, so in order to get there, I'm going to have to take off the radiator bracket, all this stuff in this area, as well as the airbox. So to get started on that, I got to drain the coolant. That definitely needed to be changed. This is Moto Chill by Bel-Ray, which starts off blue and it's now brown and smells pretty nasty. This hose is supposed to come off. I was trying to remove it from the nipple on the intake, but it is really stuck on there. It will come off of the other end on the sensor pretty easily. So I damaged it a little bit trying to get it off of that nipple. So when I get the intakes out, I'll go ahead and replace that length of hose. I need to drain the oil before I take the valve cover off so that I can check the valves. I should have thought of that before I jacked this thing up, because now my jack is in the way, so I couldn't get a drain pan under there. So I gotta get some jack stands under here. I would prefer to do this with the engine warm, so the oil drains better, but obviously I'm not going to put the throttle bodies and the intake and all that stuff back in just for that. Ever since the time I forgot gear oil once in one of my small scooters, anytime I'm going to have oil out of there for a while, if I'm not putting it right back in, I make myself a big note somewhere that I can't miss. When I removed the spark plugs, I took a close look at them, and the plug from the number 1 cylinder has some oil residue on it, while the plug from the number 2 cylinder looks pretty clean to me. So this got me a little bit nervous because I come from mostly carbureted single cylinder, very simple, no emission systems kind of scooters. So I immediately start thinking about engine issues, and I started thinking about possibly the valve stem seals, or maybe a piston ring problem or a gasket. But when I checked it over, the passages where the spark plugs go are super clean, so it doesn't look like one of the valve cover gaskets is leaking and oil's getting in that way, because the plugs are dry, that area is clean, the spark plug boots are clean, everything looks good there. Then I wanted to do a compression test to see if there was anything major going on within that cylinder. So unfortunately I had just drained the oil out of this thing, but luckily I had put the oil into a clean container on its own, so I just dumped that back in. I just put a new filter on. Yamaha says to change the filter every 12,000 something miles, and I do it every other oil change, so a little bit of old oil is really no big deal there. Went ahead and did the compression test the best I could. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any of the adapters that I had with new O-rings, trying different rubber washers on them, crush washers, etc. I just could not get a total seal. That said, I still saw 200 psi on the gauge. So Yamaha says 173.5 to 223.3 psi for a warm compression test. Seeing 200 without a seal, I'm going to say that cylinder is perfectly healthy, or at least it's healthy enough that I don't think I need to worry about it a whole lot. After seeing a good compression number, my next thought was bad valve stem seals, or a bad valve stem seal at least. So I tried to look into the intake port of the head with just a flashlight. It looks clean in there. I can't see all the way down in there that way, so I actually got out my cheap old USB bore scope, set that up, and tried to look in that way. It's such a poor resolution that I can't tell a whole lot, but I don't see a lot of shiny oil residue in there. It actually looks clean inside of the port, so I don't think that's the issue. I also looked into, put it in through the spark plug hole, and then looked at the piston crowns on both the number 1 and number 2 cylinders. And the piston crowns in both cylinders look about the same. I don't see significantly more oil in either cylinder. So I was still kind of guessing that it may be a bad valve stem seal, but I posted about it on the forum, and member DF41590 replied that maybe I had a PCV or breather issue and I should check that out. When I took a look at the throttle bodies, it was clear that there was more oil residue on one side than the other. So this is the number 1 cylinder, the same one as the spark plug that came out with more oil, and that's obviously the number 2 cylinder, and it's clear to see that that is much darker than the other one is. And this is the inlet side of the throttle bodies coming right out of the airbox. Now if I turn them around and look at the other side, there's really not a whole lot of difference over there. And that seems to be the same story with the intakes and the inlet ports on the head. Then I looked at the airbox, and there's a bit of oil residue in both of the outlets here, but there seems to be a little bit more residue on the number 1 side. Unfortunately, I can't get you a great picture of that. Whatever I try, it just doesn't show up. So at this point, I'm thinking that the gases from the breather tube are just, for whatever reason, not being distributed evenly, and more oil residue is coming through on the number 1 side than the other, and that's why I'm seeing that oil residue on my spark plug. And I think the reason that it disappears after the throttle body is because the injectors are shortly after that. I think once you get the fuel flow in the mixture, you don't see the residue hanging around everywhere. But then once it burns in the cylinder, you see the evidence on the spark plug. So there's nothing in the PCV system to replace. There's no PCV valve on this that I see. So what I'm going to do is, I was going to replace the air filter on this anyway. I've already got one here. Normally all you'd have to do is pop out these 4 screws and the air filter comes out. But since it looks like you can split this air box, I think I'm just going to go ahead and split it and then clean it out. Now I can get back to trying to check the valves. Now I need to do a couple of things at the same time. So I've got to align some timing marks that are on the other side of the engine and some marks on the cam, but in order to do that I've got to rotate the crankshaft. So to rotate the crankshaft, I'm just going to use a 29mm socket on a big ratchet here, and you use this nut here and the engine has to turn clockwise. So the easy way to think about that is you're just turning it to the right as if you're tightening the nut, or if you have a ratchet that you're using, just turn it to on or tighten. And that noise sounds bad, kind of crunchy noise. That's actually the belt in the CVT transmission. That's okay. It's not as bad as it sounds. While the engine is being rotated, you need to look into this hole where we just removed the plug. When you look in this hole, if you look up to the top there, you should be able to see there's a little pointer, kind of an arrow right there. And then this piece that you're looking at, they call the generator rotor, or basically it's your flywheel. Once this rotates around enough, you should see a hash mark in here. Basically they call it an eye mark. It's pretty much just a line on here, and you'll want that line on here to line up with that pointer up in the top built into the case. Okay, now you can see that the mark has came into view through there, and I've just got to get it aligned with that mark in the case. So at this point you'll want to move really slowly. So when you're looking through that hole and the mark on the case is aligned with a mark on the generator rotor or flywheel, then these little holes should be right where you see them now. Notice they're on the top sides of each camshaft, and they're basically, if you're looking through there, it looks like they're kind of sitting against the top surface of the cylinder head here. They're not, if they were on the bottom side, if you saw these holes down here and down here, that would be incorrect. You want to see them just like they are right now, and that is telling you that the number one cylinder, which is the cylinder closest to the camera right now, or the left side if you're sitting on the bike, is at top dead center between the compression and power stroke. So that means both valves are closed. Whenever you check valve clearance or valve lash, you want the camshaft to be on the base circle. So we can verify this another way just by looking at it, and this way you can actually do with basically any kind of four-stroke engine that you're going to adjust the valves on. So when we look down in here, this is the intake camshaft. You can say a cam lobe here, and there's a cam lobe here. Both of those are for intake valves on the number one cylinder, which is what we're working on right now. Here is the raised portion of the camshaft where all the lift happens, and then the flatter portion down there, or the actual circular rounded portion, is the base circle. So if this part of the cam, the tallest part, were up against this bucket here, then we wouldn't want to adjust the valves. We'd have to be in the wrong spot if either one of them were against these buckets here. Now that the engine is in the proper position, we can check the valve clearances for the number one cylinder, and only the number one cylinder right now. I'll explain the number two cylinder in a bit, but we want to check both of the intake valve lobes and both of the exhaust valve lobes, which are down below that, while we have the engine set this way. Now Yamaha specifies for the intake 0.15 to 0.2 millimeters of clearance, which is roughly 6 thousandths to 8 thousandths of an inch of clearance for the intake valve, and that's with the engine cold. I'm going to use this bent style of feeler gauge, even though the flat style will work. And what I'm going to do is try to put the end portion there, right between the base circle there of the camshaft and that bucket, or actually they call it the lifter. And I'm starting off with a 6 thousandths of an inch, or 0.15 millimeter thick feeler. So that is my minimum clearance. If this won't fit, then my valves are too tight. So that slides in there easily, and there's only a very, very small amount of resistance if I wiggle that up and down. I'm going to do the same thing while I've got it here on the other intake valve. And that feels pretty similar. Now I'm going to move up to the 7 thousandths of an inch, or 0.18 millimeter thickness gauge, and I'll do the same thing. That will fit in there. It's a little bit snug trying to get it started, and there's minor resistance. With this one, there's a reasonable amount of resistance there. So that one's probably roughly 7 thousandths of an inch for this intake valve. This one appears to be just slightly larger than that. Now the 8 thousandths, or 0.20 millimeters, that would be my maximum clearance for the intake valves. Now, I could probably push it in there if I really wanted, but that's not what we're trying to do when we do this. On the other side, same deal, doesn't really fit. And 10 thousandths of an inch feeler feels good, feels about right on this one. Move over to the other one, and on this one, 10 thousandths is snug, but I can get it in there. It doesn't feel too tight. I don't think I'm going to fit anything else in there though. Now I want to check the valves on the number two cylinder, so what I have to do is rotate the crankshaft around one full revolution, or 360 degrees. So I can look in that hole on the other side of the engine and once again align the two marks that I showed you earlier. Because it is difficult to go back and forth looking at that and turning the crankshaft, what I'm going to do to make it a little easier on myself is I'm going to put a mark here on this point of the crankshaft, and then I'm going to put a mark here where that aligns on my case, and that'll make it really quick to rotate this thing around roughly 360 degrees. There, once again, these two marks are aligned after just one full revolution. When I go back to the other side and take a look, then I can see that these two marks are aligned with each other once again, and that's how it should be. Just in case you're wondering, the reason that these two marks align, however I'm changing how the camshafts are sitting, is because camshafts actually rotate at 1/2 of engine speed. So the camshafts will rotate one time for every 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. Now if we look at the camshafts, we can see that those very small holes are basically the opposite position to where they were. So right now they're here, and they were down here. Now I'm just going to go through the same process that I did for the number 1 cylinder on the number 2 cylinder. I'm going to start with a 6/1000 feeler. That goes in pretty easy. Same deal on the other one. Move up to 7/1000. That feels about right. A little more snug here, but not too far off. Pretty sure 8/1000 is not going to go, but I'll check. 8/1000 will go, but I got to kind of push it in, and then it's just stuck. Doesn't even want to go on this one. Now I'll check the exhaust valves on number 2, starting with a 0.100 of an inch or 0.25 millimeter feeler gauge. Well, that'll go, but as you can see, I'm forcing that thing in there, and once it's in there, it is tight. On this one, it goes the way it should. That's actually about 0.100 of an inch, I would say. Here's an 8/1000. 8/1000 feels about right to me. After checking and double checking everything, I've made up this graphic to help us see what's going on. And you'll see here that I have labeled the intake valves 1A, 1B, and 2A, 2B, and also the exhaust valves as 1A, 1B, and 2A, 2B. And you can check out the graphic that'll show you exactly where each one is. Let's start by looking at the intake valves. So you can see on my line there, I've got 0.6 to 0.8 of an inch as the in-spec range. That's very slightly off of the book specs, but I'm using that because my feeler gauges are all standard with metric as the secondary function of them. Everything there falls in line pretty much as I'd hope. 1A, 1B, and 2A all feel like they're right about 0.7 of an inch. 2B is a little bit on the loose side toward 0.8 of an inch, but still in the center range there. So everything looks pretty good on the intake side. When we move over to the exhaust valves, unfortunately things don't look quite as good. So you can see there I've got a range of 0.100 to 0.12 of an inch as my in-spec range. Again, it varies slightly versus the book spec, but my feeler gauges are standard. So 1A and 2A pretty much sit right on 0.100 of an inch. 1B feels like a snug 0.100 of an inch because it's kind of tough to say it fits somewhere between 9 and 0.100, but to me it feels like a little snug, more toward the 0.100. However, when we look at 2B, that one's setting way out of the range at about 0.8 of an inch clearance. So it's pretty far off being too tight. That means that I at least need to do something about exhaust valve 2B, and I should probably do something about exhaust valve 1B, possibly 1A and 2A. And here's my logic on this. So valves can actually wear and increase or decrease clearance. It depends where they're wearing. So normally increases in clearance come from wear on something like the cam lobes, the lifters, or the valve stems, and decreases in clearance come from something like wear on the valve head or the valve seats. And if you think about how the valve system works, you can kind of figure out why that is. And another thing to consider is that generally, if the valves are wearing more clearance into them or less clearance into them, the clearance tends to continue going that same direction. So if your valves are tightening up, they're probably going to continue to tighten up. And if your valves are loosening or increasing in clearance, then over time they're probably going to continue to increase clearance. If we got lucky and the stars aligned for us, then what would happen is valve clearance would stay the same over time, because you'd have an equal amount of wear on the things that decrease clearance, again like the valve heads and the valve seats, as you had wear on the things that increase clearance, like the lifters and the valve stems and the lobes on the camshaft. Unfortunately, that's not usually how it works out, or that's not always how it works out. As you can see on my exhaust side, clearly I'm getting a lot more wear on the things that decrease clearance. Many valve train designs will allow you to adjust valve clearance without needing any additional parts. So there's just an adjuster somewhere in there. You adjust that until your clearance is within the spec that you're looking for, and then you're good to go. In this case, Yamaha uses a system where they have what they call an adjustment pad, which is basically a shim that sits between the valve stem and the lifter. And you actually have to take the cams out and measure what you have in there, and then they have different shims available, or adjustment pads again as they call them, which the service manual says is in 0.002 of an inch increments. So let's say that with 2B, I want to adjust that one. Whatever's in there, if I go up one increment of 0.002, then that would put me basically at the bottom, the tightest side of in spec. So since everything on the exhaust side seems to be wearing tighter, again since I assume that they wanted it to start in the middle there, I would lean toward going up 0.004 if possible on the shim there, and that would put me at the loose side, and hopefully as it wears over time and tightens, I've got a while before it goes out of spec. And what I'm thinking right now is that also with 1A, 2A, and 1B on the exhaust side, I'm going to try to go up 0.002 of an inch, and again that should put me on the loose side, and if they continue to wear and tighten, then I should be okay for a while. In order to adjust the valves, I first got to remove the exhaust camshaft. So I want my engine on top dead center of the number 1 cylinder between the compression and power stroke, just like I had it to check the valves the first time around for the number 1 cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate my engine around 360 degrees. Again, just like always, this is clockwise rotation. Just like when I was adjusting valves, I've made sure that the mark on the rotor and the timing pointer on the engine are both aligned. Now look at the camshafts, and if everything's correct, you should see that those small dots that I showed you earlier are just like they were for checking the number 1 cylinder. They are just above the top of the head on the top side. Now there's a timing chain tensioner rod access plug right back here on the side of the cylinder that you've got to remove. It's tucked in behind the frame, but luckily on this side of the frame they actually give you an access point, a hole that you can get a 10mm Allen socket through. Now I need to remove the cam chain tensioner, which is right down there where I'm shining the light. The service manual actually tells you to remove the fuel tank as part of the valve adjustment, which I didn't see as necessary. However, I'm looking at this and I could probably get in there to remove the timing chain tensioner. I think I would need a flat ratchet, like basically something like a serpentine belt tensioner tool, if you've ever seen one of those, to get to the back bolt. But then it's going to be hard to get back in, and I can't properly retorque it, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the fuel tank like you're supposed to. The service manual says to use a pump to extract the fuel from the tank before you remove it. I'm going to try to just go ahead and remove the 4 bolts that hold the tank down, and as long as it doesn't seem to go horribly when I try to pick it up, I will just carefully take it somewhere where I can store it on a flat surface and where it's safe. Now I've got easy access to the adjuster. I've got a bunch of sand and dead insects and other debris lying around on top of my cylinders, and I really don't want any of that ending up inside the engine when I remove my adjuster over here. So I'm going to go ahead and first vacuum that out with a shop vac, and then I'm going to try and blow it off with compressed air just to make sure it's clean. I've got any of the holes in the side of the engine plugged, and I've got towels and rags over top of any open areas of the engine. You're also supposed to remove the gasket. In my case, the gasket came right along with the tensioner. I'm going to go ahead and stuff a rag in here just to be sure that that big hole at the top of the engine doesn't have anything fall into it. What you're going to see here is actually the second time that I have removed the cams and put them back in. The first time around what I did was I just removed the exhaust cam because that's all I needed to get to was the exhaust lifters below there. Although the service manual tells you to remove the intake cam and then the exhaust cam, and when you put them back in, put the exhaust cam in first, then put the intake cam back in. So what I learned the first time around is that you really do have to either remove or at least loosen that top cam up, the intake cam up quite a bit. So you might as well just go ahead and do it the service manual way, and that's what I'll show you this time. And by the way, you'll see why I need to remove and install these twice later on in the video. But to begin with, I need to remove the intake camshaft. So I'm going to take this cap off of here, and you want to work with the bolts outside to inside in a crisscross pattern. Now I'm going to try to remove the cam cap by pulling it straight out. You may find that the cam comes with the cam cap, and you may also find that this won't come off easily and you have to do a little bit of extra work. So let's see. Okay, that actually came off fairly easily, and the cam stayed in there this time. First time around, the cam came right with the cap. When you get this off, make sure you know where your dowels are. In this case, they stayed in here. Otherwise, check your block, and you may want to remove those until you're ready to reinstall the cam. Now I'm going to hold my cam and try to get the chain off of there. Just sort of work it off of the sprocket. And then I can remove the cam. Now it's the same process to remove the exhaust cam. Again, work from outside, inward, in a crisscross pattern when you remove these bolts. Before removing this cam cap and potentially the cam and the chain, I want to make sure I take care of my chain so it can't fall into the case. So I'm going to pull on that a little bit and take a bungee cord, wrap that through there, and then I'm going to wrap this around my frame somewhere so I can hold a little bit of tension on there. At the same time, I'm trying to get it off of the camshaft. There it goes. So this time you can see it's the cam and the cam cap. Again, the dowels are still in here. Don't be alarmed by all this gray stuff. Again, like I told you, this is actually the second time I've done this, so that is some assembly lube on there. And now I'm going to just take a rag and stuff that into this area of the case. That way nothing can fall down in there. I'm about to remove these buckets or lifters and the pads that are underneath each one of them. But before I do, you have to make sure that whenever you remove one of these, you know exactly where it came from. For a couple of reasons. One, these valve train parts tend to wear together, so you're better off to put them back together that way. But also, they have those adjustment pads underneath of them, and you've done your valve clearance measurements, so you need to know what pad came from where so that you know what you need to order. So what I did is I just took plastic sandwich bags and I labeled each one exhaust 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, etc. And even on the first bag, just to make sure I couldn't mess this up, I made myself a little diagram of what 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B means. You could just lay them out on a piece of paper, you could put them into some sort of storage container with dividers, whatever you want to do, just make sure that you are certain of where each one came from. I'm going to use a valve lapping tool just as Yamaha recommends in the service manual. A valve lapping tool, if you haven't seen one, is basically just a suction cup on the end of the stick. So you can push that up against there and it should stick to it and pull it out. But if you don't have one, you should be able to kind of work these out with your fingers or just get a magnet on there and pull it out with a magnet if you have to. So I'm going to start right here on the far end with this one. I call it 1B. So let's see how this suction cup works. Stick that on there and then slide it out, hopefully. There we go, worked pretty well. There's what the bucket looks like when you look on the underside. Then you can see the adjustment pad underneath of there. And you should be able to pretty easily break that free. It just kind of sticks to there. So I'm just going to wipe the excess oil out of this thing. Get it off of the pad as well. And then I can drop those into the bag that has been labeled for them. Now it's the same process for the rest. Just make sure that you don't get in a hurry and mix anything up. Before I go any further, I know that the engine is going to be apart just like this for a little while because I'm going to have to order some of those valve pads once I figure out what I need. So I'm going ahead and covering everything up with a big drop cloth here. Again, as usual, just to try and keep everything out of the engine and keep it safe. I put my labeled bags into their own box just because it's very important that these don't get damaged or lost. But right now what I want to do is take each bag out and I want to kind of take stock or inventory of what I have here. So this is 1A. I'm going to go ahead and take that out. Once you get that out of there, you should see that there's a number printed on one side of the valve pad. In this case, you can see it says 180. So what that means is this is 1.80 millimeters thick because the number is the amount of hundredths of millimeters. So 1.80 for 180. Now record the number from that valve pad next to the cylinder that it corresponds with. Now just keep going and do all of the remaining valves. Make sure you only do them one at a time because you don't want to get any of these measurements mixed up. I went back to my notes from my valve clearance checks and I wrote down the valve clearance alongside of each one of my valve pad measurements, and I wrote that down in millimeters instead of inches. So if you did inches as well, then what you can do is either use an approximation like you'll see on all of these gauges, or you can convert and find an exact number. And I'll put some conversions down this side of the screen for you. Next, I would need to figure out my desired valve clearance. I've already went over that earlier in the video when I showed you the graphs and kind of the charts of how my valve clearance is laid out. In the service manual, they tell you just to find the difference between the measured valve clearance and the specified valve clearance. So they give the example of specified valve clearance between 0.15 and 0.22 millimeters and measured valve clearance of 0.25 millimeters. So in that case, you would take 0.25 millimeters and subtract 0.22 millimeters, which is the largest end or the closest end of their specs to the number that they recorded. And then that gives them 0.03 millimeters, and that's how much of a change of thickness that you need in the valve pad. After you know the measured clearance as well as the desired clearance, then you can figure out the difference between those two. So in my case, one of my valves, for example, I measured 0.25 millimeters of clearance and I want 0.30 millimeters of clearance. So 0.30 minus 0.25 is 0.05 millimeters difference. So you just go through and do that for every one of your valves, figure out what the difference is. When you do this, keep in mind whether this is going to be a positive or a negative change. In my example, my valves are tightening up and I need to loosen up the valve clearance or widen the valve clearance. I need to create more clearance. So if you're going to create more clearance, you have to remove material. So that means I need to remove 0.05 millimeters of thickness. Now if on the other hand, I had measured wide clearances, say for example I had measured 0.35 millimeters, and I wanted to get to a 0.30 millimeter spec, that's still 0.05 millimeters of difference, but in that case I have to add 0.05 millimeters to get it into spec. So make sure you pay attention to that. Once you've determined the number that you want to add or subtract for each valve, then it's pretty simple to figure out what you want as far as a valve pad. So what you do is you take the number that you got off of the valve pad for that cylinder, and then add or subtract the number that you just came up with. So for example, in valve 1A for me, the valve pad was 1.80 millimeters thick and I want to subtract 0.05 millimeters, so I would be looking for a valve pad that is 1.75 millimeters thick, and go through and do that for every valve that you need to adjust. In the service manual, it says that there are 25 thicknesses available in 0.05 millimeter increments. So that means it either ends in a 0 or a 5. In my case, I have two cylinders that I've calculated would need a 1.76 millimeter thick valve pad, but I would have to choose between 1.75 and 1.8 or 1.70. Yamaha has a chart in their service manual to tell you exactly how to round off whatever numbers you come up with. So I'll go ahead and put that information up on the screen. So in my example of 1.76 being what I was looking for, they tell me that the last digit of 6 should be rounded off to a 5, so I would make that 1.75 is what I'm actually looking for. One thing that I found interesting in my case is that when I figured out which pads that I would need for each cylinder, they came out to 1.75 for two cylinders and 1.76 for two cylinders, which when I rounded those off means I need 1.75 millimeter thickness pads for every cylinder. But what I thought was interesting is the one cylinder that had a much too narrow clearance actually had a much thicker pad than all of the others. So all of the other pads were 1.8 or 1.81 for my engine, and that cylinder that had a tight clearance was 1.86. So if they actually had a 1.80 or 1.81 millimeter pad in there to begin with, it should have been right on the bottom of the specs. So I'm not sure if that's something that maybe got messed up at the factory or just an odd coincidence. The valve pads should be made of a hardened material that's not likely to wear, but if you want to be 100% safe, you can measure them. So again, it says 180 on here. What I'd hope to see is 1.80 millimeters when I measure it. And I see 1.800, so no problem with that one. My second Yamaha parts order just came in, and I don't know about you, but it's almost hard to believe that this is $87 worth of parts. It's basically 4 valve adjustment pads, 1 gasket for the tensioner, and then essentially a bunch of O-rings. These are a little different than a standard O-ring. They call them gaskets for the valve cover. And I did screw up, and I actually ordered 4 fuel injector O-rings. I don't know why, but these things, basically as big as your pinky, are $4.30 a piece, just to give you an idea. But anyway, I've got the parts here so I can get back to work and try to get this thing back together, the top end at least. Now I'm ready to install my valve adjustment pads and the lifters. Luckily for me, this is really simple because every single one of them needed a 175 or 1.75 millimeter thick adjustment pad. So I don't really have anything to keep straight there. I just got to put one of these on each of the lifters. The only thing I really have to keep straight is, again, making sure that the lifter goes back onto the correct valve, the one that it came off of. They specify to use Moly on the adjustment pad, and when you install the adjustment pad into the lifter, those numbers should face the lifter. Or if you're looking at it as I am, with the lifter upside down, the numbers will be facing down. So what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of Moly on this adjuster here, this pad. I had to wipe a little off and smear it back on because it's actually really tough to keep track. You can't see very well once that grease is on there. And then drop it down into place and then get it so it sits right in the center. And then I'm just going to use motor oil and smear that around the outside and the top of the lifter. Make sure the pad is still in place in the center, and then that's ready to install. And since they want Moly on that adjustment pad, I'm going to try to just put a dab right on the tip of the valve spring if I can. Now I can go ahead and put the bucket with the adjuster in there over top of the valve. I'm going to take a little bit more oil and put that right on top of the lifter. What I just showed you there is wrong. By the book, the way you're actually supposed to do that, this should be lubricated with Moly Lube, and the number should be facing up or outward. And then you should set this in on top of the valve stem there, right in that circle. Put that in place. Then you would lubricate your lifter with oil and put that on top of that. I'm ready to reinstall the camshaft, so the first thing I need to do is get this rag out of my way. Before each camshaft goes back in, you want to clean them thoroughly and then give them a little bit of a coating of assembly lube. You don't have to pile it on there thick, but just make sure it has at least a coating. I made sure that my timing mark that I can view through the side of the engine is still where I want it. It hasn't moved. The marks are aligned there. And now I'm going to try to install my exhaust camshaft first. And I know that when this is installed this way, I want this small hole right here to be facing up and basically look like it's right above the surface of the cylinder head. So I'm going to try to get it started into the camshaft and laying into the motor so that it is oriented that way, though it's almost certain that I'm going to have to go back and adjust it a little bit. And once I've got that laid in there a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and remove my bungee cord so it doesn't hold me up. Just got to be careful at this point that you don't drop the chain now. So I've got the cam sitting where I want it, but I need to remember to keep tension on the exhaust side. So I need that bottom section of the cam chain pulled kind of taut so that there's not a lot of slack when it comes onto the bottom of the cam sprocket there. So I'm going to pull that to remove the slack. I've got it where I want it otherwise aligned, and then wrap that around the camshaft. Looking at it from the side, you can see that small hole that I want to be just above the top of the cylinder head there. So what I can do is hold the cam sprocket and the cam into the engine while I keep the chain off of it for a second and rotate that to about where I want it. Then I can put some tension on the chain so that the tension is on the bottom of the cam sprocket and pull that over the cam sprocket. Now when I'm holding tension on that, I take another look and that appears to be correct. That's about where I'd want the cam. And here's how that should look from this side. I've got slack up here, but this side is taut. It's pulled fairly tight against there. And another way you can think about that is I could actually rotate the cam that way. I can't rotate it this way anymore because, again, there's no slack down there. Now for the intake cam, it's just like the exhaust cam. I'm going to go ahead and coat all the lobes as well as these contact patches for the head with an assembly lube. The intake is again very similar to the exhaust because you want that hole, that small hole, facing toward the top and basically so that it looks like it's sitting right on the top of the cylinder head, much like the exhaust cam. And when you're doing this, you still want to try to keep that tension on the bottom of the exhaust cam, and you want to keep tension between the two cams. So you don't want a bunch of slack in the chain between the two camshafts when you're trying to get this in there. Again, looking at this from the side, you can see that my exhaust cam is still installed so that the hole is right above the head, and now my intake cam is installed above it with that hole sitting right above the cylinder head. And again, looking at it from this side, you can see we're still keeping the tension down here on the bottom side of the exhaust cam, and between the two cam sprockets, that's as tight as we're going to get it. We don't have a lot of slack in there. Now the cam cap should go on, starting with the exhaust. And again, you want to make sure you have both of the dowels in place, either in the cap or in the block in those larger holes. Same deal for the intake cam cap, cleaned, assembly lubed, and verified that my dowels are in there. Then I can go ahead and pop that on. The cap bolts are supposed to be lubricated with motor oil, so since I keep them in a bag anyway, I just put a small amount of motor oil in there, kind of slosh them around in it, and then they're all lubricated and ready to go. And anytime I'm doing this for installation, you want to work inside to outside in a crisscross pattern. So what I normally do is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Anything similar to that should be fine. And now I'm just working to get them slightly snug. I'm not trying to torque them right now. At this point, I've installed the bolts into both of the cam caps. This one finger tight, that one finger tight. This one just loosely snug, I'll call it, with a ratchet, basically just seated with the ratchet. And then I'm not going to touch the intake again until I've got the exhaust torqued. And I learned the hard way the first time around that what happens is the intake cam is trying to open on the number 2 side, and when you try to torque that down, if the exhaust cam isn't tight already, when you put any pressure on there, basically it will try to make the camshaft slip, and it might go out of time, and you can't really get it back into time without backing it back off. So when you do this, make sure, I just installed both so that I don't have to worry about the cams going anywhere or falling out. But I'm going to torque this one first, the exhaust side first, and then I'll take care of the intake side. Here's something else that I think you should know before you go any further, and I can't find this in the service manual anywhere, but it seems to be a pretty helpful thing from what I've done so far. So if you look down here at the bottom of the cam, I'm not sure how well it shows up in the shot, but maybe you can see as I've tightened up the exhaust cap a little bit, it's starting to loosen up down here on the bottom of the cam chain. It's trying to pull the cam where it wants to go, but we don't want it to do that. We need to keep tension here. So if you look at this hole right here, it's right beside that small hole that we're always trying to align. You can see a flat surface behind it. And I've discovered if you have something like a pick or an awl that's basically cone shaped, it continues to get larger, then what you can do is push that into there, and that will hold everything in place. So you should see the sprocket move as I get it in there a little bit. You kind of got to wiggle it, and then that will hold it in place, and it tightens up the slack that is in that cam chain before that's done. The other thing I found that works a little better in a different order than the service manual for me is that they say to install the exhaust cam cap and torque it, and install the intake cam cap and torque it, and then install the cam chain tensioner. I like to install the exhaust cam cap. It can be torqued, and then before the bolts are torqued on the intake cam cap, again, I'm using this all in here to lock the exhaust cam sprocket in place. And then to keep tension on the chain, I actually install the cam chain tensioner, and then I will go ahead and torque this. Otherwise, I found that it can still slip. When you lock this in place, sometimes the intake cam will try to slip out. Now I need to get the cam chain tensioner ready to go back in. So I'm going to take off this old gasket and then clean it up a bit. Now the tensioner rod needs to be pressed up into the tensioner body. So before I do that, I want to point a couple things out that I'm not sure if you'll see very well. First off, this has to be squeezed together, but you also need to turn the rod clockwise, just like you're screwing it in to the body. So squeeze and screw that in at the same time. Second, there's a groove down here, and if you look up here, you'll see 2 clips. One clip is already in a groove that holds the rod into the body. The other clip will need to be positioned into that groove to keep the body, or to keep the rod, tucked up into the tensioner for now. There's what it looks like with the clip in place in that groove. And now I've got a paper towel stuffed in here, that way I can wipe this down or scrape it if I need to, which it doesn't look like I need to. So I'm just wiping it down with a little bit of rubbing alcohol to make sure it's clean for the new gasket. One good thing about the new gasket is you really can't get it wrong if you're paying any attention, because if you line the bolt holes up that way, nothing else aligns, so you know you have to flip it over. And then everything aligns. Put my bolts through here. Now I need to push up on the timing chain guide, which will then push up on the timing chain tensioner and release it. So when you're looking at the side of the engine and the frame, you'll see this hole in the frame. Behind that hole in the frame is a hole in the engine that we've got to look through in order to see this. I don't know that I can point this out to you right now because I'm trying to hold a flashlight in exactly the right spot while I'm staring at the screen to make sure it's in the right spot. But if you look at the chain, right above that you'll see a piece of plastic. That's the tensioner guide that we want to push upward. The idea is to not press the chain, but to press the guide up, to push the guide up. So let's see if I can actually do this. There we go. Now I'm going to remove this all, and I can actually see already that there's no tension on it, so nothing should pop out of place when it's removed. Now I can verify that my cams are still aligned as they should be. When I look through this hole, I should still see that the timing mark in there is aligned as it was. Now to be sure that everything is correct, I'm going to rotate the engine around at least a few times. And now I'm going to try to align my timing marks again. Now I'm going to take one last look at my camshafts, the same marks we've been looking at over and over again. They're still where they should be. And one last look inside there to make sure those timing marks are still where they should be. So if all of that stuff is correct, then at this point the cam should be properly installed. After doing a valve adjustment, I don't just want to carry on and assume that everything is okay. I'm going to go back through here and check the exhaust valves, every one of them again, because I want to make sure that they actually ended up where I expect them to be. The whole process doesn't do a lot of good if you don't end up with your valves adjusted correctly. And immediately I have a problem because this valve I expected to be at 12 thousandths and it feels like it's really snug. There's no way that I can even get it started in there. And I think it's probably considerably less than 12 thousandths, but I'm going to check and see if any of these fit. Even a 6 thousandths of an inch thick feeler gauge will not fit in there, so something is way off for some reason. I'm going to go ahead and rotate the engine around 360 degrees and check the number 2 cylinder's exhaust valves just to be sure of what I'm getting into before I take anything else apart. But I have a feeling I'm going to have to take the cam back out because something's gone wrong. If I had to guess, I would imagine maybe that adjustment pad fell out of place when I reinstalled the lifter. That's about the only thing I can think of, but eventually we're going to find out. Yep, sure enough. I'm not sure if you got to see it or not in the last shot, but now you can see the valve pad is sitting down there because it was just sitting on the bottom of the valve and slid right off. So I think it's like I thought, and this thing just got displaced. It didn't stay in place, and that threw the valve adjustment or the valve clearance off. Well, I'm still not done because I checked my valve clearances again, and this time I do have 12 thousandths of an inch right here on 1B, where before it was 0 clearance. However, I've got 12 here, and 23 thousandths here on what I call 1A. So I took the cam out, and then when I look at the lifters, I can see that this one sits higher than this one. This is the one that has 23 thousandths of an inch clearance. This is the one that's at 12 thousandths where it should be. I can measure, and this is indeed about 11 thousandths of an inch difference in where they're sitting. Then I remove the lifters, and again I can see that this valve assembly, the retainer and the stem, are sitting lower than this valve assembly. So now the question is, why would that valve be sitting lower in the head than the other valves? I can only think of two reasons. One would be perhaps there's something stuck between the valve head and the valve seat, and that would partially hold the valve open. So I tried to compress the valve, push it down, and I was hoping maybe it would break free or something. If there was anything in there, it would fall out. No luck there, it still sets low. The other thing that I can think of is that perhaps the valve is bent. But how would the valve get bent? I'm going to back up a little bit for a couple of reasons. First, I think maybe it will give you a little bit of insight into why I may have bent a valve. And second, I think it's useful information for anyone doing a job on the TMAX like this, or possibly some other similar power sports vehicles. So you'll have to excuse me a little bit. I'm going to be looking at my notes because I have installed the cam so many times, twice, 2 or 3 times, I can't even remember now, totally through the job with it correct, and multiple times where it didn't work out as it was supposed to. So I've got it written down just so I can keep it straight. So anyway, if you follow Yamaha's service manual, here's how it's supposed to go. You install the exhaust and the intake cams in the chain, and then you put the cams into the head. Then you install both cam caps. Just put the cam caps and dowels in place. Then you torque the exhaust cam cap, and then you torque the intake cam cap, and then you install the chain tensioner. Easy. It sounds like super simple. Who couldn't do that? If you follow the directions, it should go very smoothly according to that. Sounds like no trouble. However, here's how it actually goes. What I would do is install the exhaust and intake cams, get them lined up in the chain, put them in the head. I'd put the exhaust cam cap on, the intake cam cap on, then I would go to torque the exhaust cam cap, and because of the way I believe the number 2 valves are in the exhaust cam cap, it would then pop off of the chain. The cam would basically skip teeth every time that I tried to torque the exhaust cam cap. So that doesn't work. So then I found that there's a hole on the exhaust cam, which I've shown you, and that I could put that all through there or whatever. You can kind of lock it into place. And I thought that that would be enough, that okay, now this is going to lock the exhaust cam in place and everything should be good. So then how it goes is you get as far as torquing the exhaust cam cap down, and that's okay. But then when you try to torque the intake cam cap down, it skips teeth. It's either going to skip teeth, either the intake cam is going to move or the whole chain is going to skip teeth on one or both of the cam sprockets. That's how it went for me, at least, every single time I tried it. So at this point I'm really wondering what I'm doing wrong, because again, the manual makes it sound super easy. There should be no complications the way it's laid out. I did manage to get it set up that way once or twice, I think twice. And then when I went to the step where you rotate the engine over, as soon as I start to rotate the engine, the cam chain jumps off, the sprockets are out of whack, and everything has to be redone again. Eventually, after a bunch of trial and error, I found what works for me, and that's what I showed you earlier in the video. But let me recap this just to show you how it differs after explaining the other ways that I tried it, or the way the service manual said to do it. So again, in my method, first I put the exhaust and the intake cams into the chain, and then put those into the head. Then I installed both of the cam caps just loose. I did put the bolts in, but they weren't torqued down or even snugged down really. Then I put an awl or whatever object through that hole that I showed you in the side of the exhaust cam, or actually the cam sprocket for the exhaust, so that it sort of locked in place against the flat surface that's behind that hole. Once I did that, then I torqued down the exhaust cam cap. After torquing down the exhaust cam cap, then I installed the chain tensioner. Now, I think you could probably actually install the cam chain tensioner even before the exhaust cam cap was installed, or before it was torqued. But at any rate, I installed it after torquing that, and then I could torque the cam cap for the intake, and at that point, everything seemed to work. And when I got to the stage where I was rotating the engine around, the cam chain didn't pop off. So finally a working way to do it, however, not the way that Yamaha really specifies. And to be honest, I am pretty green to dual overhead cam stuff. I've worked on a whole lot of single overhead cam, scooter, moped, whatever, pit bike, etc. engines for many years. So that's not really a big deal, and you don't usually have, it's single overhead cam, so you don't have two cams to lock together and so on. It's much simpler. And I've also worked on small block Fords like the 5.0 Mustangs and stuff from years ago a decent amount, so I'm used to that stuff. I've never been like an import guy. I don't own motorcycles, so I haven't done a lot of, or any, dual overhead cams like this, so there's certainly a learning curve. So what I did was I went online after this happened just to see if I'm really the only person out there struggling with this. I pretty much just searched YouTube videos, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, to be fair, but from the videos that I watched, generally it was one of two things. When they got to installing the cams, either they would go into great detail about every other step, the adjustment pads, shims, whatever, putting the buckets in, and then magically they'd cut back and the cam and cam caps were all installed and everything's super easy and on they go. Or some of the videos they actually did install the cam caps and the chain and sprockets, etc., and it looked like it went smoothly. Like when they bolted the cam caps down, I didn't see everything trying to pull different directions or whatever, so I assume that in some applications it's just not even an issue. So then I start to think, you know, what's wrong with me? I can't be the only person struggling with this. There has to be somebody else that mentions that things don't always go exactly as planned, or maybe don't follow the service manual exactly, something like that. And what came up after a little more time was a video from Yamaha, I think Yamaha Tech Academy or something along those lines, but directly from Yamaha for their service techs about installing camshafts on some kind of UTV, I believe it was. I'll put a link in the description either way. But what I saw in that was that they mentioned the cams trying to pop out of position. They also mentioned that they use wire ties or cable ties to secure the cam chains to the sprockets. They put a cable tie on both sprockets, put it through a hole and around the chain, and then tighten it down. That way the cam really, or the chain really can't move. It's held securely to the sprockets. But what that showed me is, apparently Yamaha probably had some idea at least that this may not go the way they lay it out as being so easy in the manual, and they don't lay out all the steps. Why in the manual couldn't they include something like tip, install cable ties on the sprockets? It wouldn't be that hard. They give you plenty of other tips. So I'm not blaming Yamaha at all or anyone else for me bending a valve. That's my stupidity, first off, and I'll get to that in a second. I'm just including this information because I think it will be useful to someone else. And also maybe you'll understand that I did go through this process numerous times. Still, we're left at, how the heck did you bend a valve doing a valve adjustment or installing camshafts? That doesn't make any sense. Well, I don't know exactly when it bent, but I do remember that one of the times I rotated the engine over for some reason and I felt a tight spot. So it kind of stopped. So rather than push through, I backed up and I wanted to see if it released anything, because I suspected that it was the cam chain having some sort of issue binding up somewhere. So I backed it up and then it stopped again, and then I went forward again and it stopped, and I could see that whenever I did this that the cam chain was moving around on the sprockets. So what I thought was happening was the cam chain was getting hung up on things, and that's what was keeping me from moving. So rather than do the smart thing when something binds up a little bit and getting down on the floor and checking everything out to make sure there's nothing awry, I just said, well, let's see if it goes through there without too much effort. And I put a little bit of force on it, not a whole lot, and it rotated around. Now, not a whole lot of force may be a relative term when you are using roughly a 2 foot, it's at least a 1.5 foot long ratchet to turn the crank nut. So it could be that it was considerably more force than I really thought it was. But that's my best guess of what actually happened. And I will say, to Yamaha's credit, they do note to never turn the engine over while you're working on the cams. and for a good reason, which I've probably just shown all of us. And I know better than this. I can't even tell you how irritated I am with myself and disappointed in myself, because I may not have a lot of experience with dual overhead cams and this sort of stuff. However, I've worked on enough engines to know darn well that if you get resistance somewhere, a tight spot, you don't just try to muscle through it. And again, I didn't muscle through it hard. I wasn't putting a whole lot of pressure on there. But still, I know better than to do that, and I was dumb enough to do it anyway. And now here I am. I'm going to end up having to take the head off of there and probably replace a valve, head gasket, all the other stuff associated with it. So I've caused myself a bunch of trouble. I'm going to be honest and say there's part of me that wishes I could just fix this thing, pretend it never happened, not even show it on video. However, I tend not to be that way. I would rather show you the real experience. So I'm going to let you go ahead and call me a dummy or whatever you want. So be it. Maybe it'll teach somebody. And one thing I think is that even though I knew this already, not to rotate through, not to push through anything, I have a feeling it's going to stick in my head pretty well after this to never do that. Just like, if you recall, some of you that have been around a while may have seen my gear oil fail video where I forgot to put gear oil in one of my scooters and destroyed the entire gearbox basically. And now every time something is apart without oil or gear oil in it for a little while, I make sure to make a note. I think this one might stick with me as well, so maybe this will never happen again. But with that said, I think I have shown you how to properly adjust the valves, check the valves, etc. So I'm going to end this video here, and I guess one of the next times you see me, I will probably be pulling the cylinder head off of this and trying to figure out if it is indeed a bent valve and getting it repaired. But as always, thank you for watching. Hopefully you've learned something. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe for more.